This chapter is 20 pages, so we'll see how far I get. I don't know, I might only do this one chapter. So yeah, we'll see. Chapter 6. In my creaky chair. Undersea, oversea, understone. Now then, said Great Uncle Mary as they strode down the hill to the harbor. It's a splendid afternoon for a walk. Which way do you want to go? Somewhere lonely. Somewhere miles from anywhere. Somewhere we can talk. Great Uncle Mary looked down at them from one strained face to the next. His bleak, impassive expression did not change as he simply said, Very well, and lengthened his stride so that they had to trot to keep up. He asked no questions, but walked in silence. They climbed the winding little street on the side of the harbor opposite Kenmare Head and the Grey House, and followed the cliff path past the last straggling houses of the village, until the great purple-green sweep of the opposite headland rose before them. Up the slope they toiled, through heather and prickling gorse, past rough outcroppings of grey rock patched yellow with lichen and weathered by the wind. There had been no breath of a breeze down in the harbor, but here the wind was loud in their ears. Gosh, said Barney, pausing and turning outward to look down. Look! They turned with him and saw the harbor far below and the grey house tiny on the threading road. Already they were higher than their own headland, and still the rock-scarred slope stretched above them to meet the sky. They turned again and scrambled up the slope, and at last they were at the top of the headland, with the line of the surf laid out like a slow-moving map below them on either side, and beyond it the great blue sweep of sea. One big, slanting boulder of granite stood higher than any they had passed on the way up, and Great Uncle Mary sat down with his back against it, his legs arched up before him, long and knobbly in their flapping brown corduroys. The children stood together, looking down. The land before them was unfamiliar, a silent, secret world of mounded peaks and invisible valleys, all its colors merging in a haze of summer heat. Hic incipit regum Logres, Great Uncle Mary said, looking out at them across it all as if he were reading out an inscription. What does that mean? Here begins the realm of Logres. Now, come on, the three of you, and sit down. They squatted down beside him, in a semicircle before the big rock. Great Uncle Mary surveyed them, as if he were enthroned. Well, he said gently, who tells me what's wrong? In the quiet, with only the sound of the wind stirring the air, Jane and Barney looked at Simon. Well, it was the burglar, he said haltingly. We were worried. And then the three of them were all tumbling out the words. When Miss Withers came the other night, she was asking questions about the Grey House and whether we'd found anything. And so did Mr. Withers on their yacht. He asked me about old books. And whoever it was last night, they only touched the books and the old lamps. They were looking for it, they must have been. Only they didn't know where to look. They didn't know we already had it. Suppose they know we've got it. They might come after us. Great Uncle Mary raised one hand, though he did not move. His chin was up. He looked as if he were waiting for something. Gently now, he said. If you have found something in the Grey House, what is it you have found? Simon felt inside the rucksack. He drew out the case and handed the parchment to Great Uncle Mary. We found this. Great Uncle Mary took the parchment without a word, and gently unrolled it on his knees. He gazed at it in silence for a long while, and they could see his eyes moving over the words. The wind on the headland whined softly round them, and, although as they watched, Great Uncle Mary's expression did not change, they suddenly knew that some enormous emotion was flooding through him. Like an electric current, it tingled in the air, exciting and frightening at the same time, though they could not understand what it was. And then he raised his head at last and looked out across the hills of Cornwall, rolling far to the distance, and he breathed a great sigh of relief that was like a release from all the worry of the whole world. "Where did you find it?" he said, and the three children jumped at the quiet, ordinary tone of his voice, as if it brought them out of the spell. "In the attic. There's a great big attic, all full of dust and junk. We found a door behind our wardrobe and a staircase leading up." "I found it," Barney said. "I threw my apple core away. And when I went to get it back because of the rats, I found the manuscript by accident under the floor." "What is it, Gameri? What does it say? It's terribly old, isn't it? Is it important? Is it about buried treasure?" "In a way," Great Uncle Mary said. His eyes seemed dazed, unable to focus anywhere. But there was a twitching at the corners of his mouth. Somehow, without smiling, he looked happier than they had ever seen him look before. Jane thought, watching, it was a sad face, usually, and that's why there is such a difference. He laid the manuscript down on his lap, and looked from Jane to Simon to Barney and back again. He seemed to be searching for words. "You have found something that may be more important than you can possibly realize," he said at last. They stared at him. He looked away again over the hills. "You remember the fairy stories you were told when you were very small, once upon a time? Why do you think they always began like that?" "Because they weren't true," Simon said promptly. Jane said, caught up in the unreality of the high remote place. "Because, perhaps, they were true once, but nobody could remember when." Great Uncle Mary turned his head and smiled at her. "That's right. Once upon a time, a long time ago. Things that happened once, perhaps, but have been talked about for so long that nobody really knows. And underneath all the bits that people have added, the magic swords and lamps, they're all about one thing. The good hero fighting the giant, or the witch, or the wicked uncle, good against bad, good against evil. Cinderella, Aladdin, Jack the Giant Killer, and all the rest." He looked down again, his fingers caressing the curving edge of the parchment. "Do you know what this manuscript is about?" "King Arthur," Barney said promptly. "And King Mark. Simon found the names in Latin." "And what do you know about King Arthur?" Barney looked around triumphantly at his captive audience, and drew a breath for a long recital, but somehow found himself stammering instead. "Well, he was King of England, and he had his knights of the Round Table, Lancelot and Galahad and Kay and all of them. And they fought jousts and rescued people from wicked knights, and Arthur beat everyone with his sword Excalibur. It was good against bad, I suppose, like you said about the fairy stories, only he was real." Great Uncle Mary's quiet, pleased smile was flickering again. "And when was Arthur King of England?" "Well," Barney waved his hand vaguely, "a long time ago." "Just like in the fairy stories," Jane finished for him. "I see. But, Gameri, what are you trying to tell us? Was King Arthur a fairy story too?" "No!" Barney said indignantly. "No," said Great Uncle Mary. "He was real. But the same thing has happened, you see. He lived such a long time ago that there's no record of him left. And so he's become a story, a legend as well." Simon fidgeted with the strap of his rucksack. "But I don't see where the manuscript comes in." The wind over the headland stirred Great Uncle Mary's white hair outlined against the sky. As he glanced down, he looked magisterial and severe. "Patience a little, and listen carefully now, because you may find this difficult to understand. First of all, you have heard me talk of Logres. It was the old name for this country, thousands of years ago, in the old days when the struggle between good and evil was more bitter and open than it is now. That struggle goes on all round us all the time, like two armies fighting. And sometimes one of them seems to be winning, and sometimes the other, but neither has ever triumphed altogether. Nor ever will," he added softly to himself, "for there is something of each in every man. Sometimes, over the centuries, this ancient battle comes to a peak. The evil grows very strong and nearly wins, but always at the same time, there is some leader in the world, a great man who sometimes needs to be more than a man, who leads the forces of good to win back the ground and the men they seem to have lost." "King Arthur," Barney said. "King Arthur was one of these," Great Uncle Mary said. He fought against the men who wanted Logres, who robbed and murdered and broke all the rules of battle. He was a strong and good man, and the people of those days trusted him absolutely. With that faith behind him, Arthur's power was very great. So great that in the stories that have grown up since, people have talked about his having magical help. But magic is just a word. I suppose he didn't win, Jane said with sudden conviction, or there wouldn't have been any wars since. No, he didn't win, Great Uncle Mary said, and even in the clear afternoon sunshine he seemed with every word to become more remote, as ancient as the rock behind him and the old world of which he spoke. He wasn't altogether beaten, but he didn't altogether win. So the same struggle between good and evil sides has gone on ever since. But the good has grown very confused, and since the old days of Logres it has been trying to regain the strength it was given by Arthur. But it never has. Too much has been forgotten. But those men who remembered the old days have been searching for its secret ever since. And there have been others searching as well. The enemies, the wicked men who have the same greed in their cold hearts as the men whom Arthur fought. Great Uncle Mary looked out into the distance, his head outlined against the sky like a proud carved head of a statue, centuries old and yet always the same. I have been searching, he said, for many, many years. The children stared at him, awed and a little afraid. For a moment he was a stranger, someone they did not know. Jane had a sudden, fantastic feeling that Great Uncle Mary did not really exist at all and would vanish away if they breathed or spoke. He looked down at them again. I was beginning to know that this part of Cornwall held what we sought, he said. I did not know that you children would be the ones to find it, or what danger you'd be putting yourselves in. Danger? Simon said incredulously. Very great danger, said Great Uncle Mary, looking him full in the face. Simon swallowed. This manuscript, Simon, puts you all right in the middle of the battle. Oh, nobody will stick a knife in your back. Their methods are more subtle than that, and perhaps more successful. He looked down at the manuscript again. This, he said more normally, is a copy. A copy? Said Barney, but it's so old. Oh, yes, it's old, about 600 years old. But it's a copy of something even older than that, written more than 900 years ago. The part at the beginning is in Latin. There, I said so, Jane said in a triumph. Simon stuck out his lower lip. Well, I translated bits of it, didn't I? Not much, though, he convinced the Great Uncle Mary. I couldn't recognize any of the words. I don't suppose you could. This is medieval Latin. Not like the Latin you learn at school. It's written by a monk who must have lived near here. And I think about 600 years ago, though there's no date. He says roughly that near his monastery an old English manuscript has been found. He says it tells of an old legend from the days of Mark and Arthur, and that he has copied out the story to save it from being lost, because the manuscript was falling to bits. He says he copied out that map, that this was with the manuscript too. Then all the rest underneath is the story that he copied out, and you can see the map right at the bottom. If the original manuscript was so old that it was falling to bits 600 years ago, Barney said, bemused. Simon broke out impatiently. Mary, can you understand the copied out part? That's not Latin, is it? No, it's not, Great Uncle Mary said. It's one of the early English dialects, the old language that used to be spoken centuries ago. But it's a very old form of it, full of the words from Old Cornish and even some from Brittany. I don't know. I'll read it out as best I can, but I may turn it into rather curious English, and I may have to stop. He peered at the manuscript again, then stumblingly and with many pauses, while he held it to the sunlight or fumbled in his mind for a word, he began to read, in his deep, far-away voice. The children sat and listened, with the sun hot on their faces and the wind still whispering in their ears. This I write, that when the time comes it shall be found by the proper man, and I leave it in the care of the old land that shall soon be no more. Into the land of Cornwall, the kingdom of Mark, there came in the days of my fathers a strange knight, fleeing towards the west. Many fled hither in those days when the old kingdom was broken by the invader and the last battle of Arthur was lost. For only in the western land did men still love God in the old ways. And the strange knight who came to the place of my fathers was called Bedwin, and he bore with him the last trust of Logres, the grail made in the fashion of the Holy Grail, that told upon its sides all the true story of Arthur, soon to be misted in men's minds. Each panel told of an evil overcome by Arthur and the company of God, until the end when evil overcame all. And the last panel showed the promise and the proof of Arthur's coming again. For behold, said the knight Bedwin to my fathers, evil is upon us now, and so shall it be for time beyond our dreaming. Yet, if the Grail, that is, the last trust of the old world, be not lost, then when the day is ripe, the Pendragon shall come again, and at the last all shall be safe, and evil be thrust out, never to return. So that the trust be kept, he said, I give it into your charge, and your sons' sons, until the day come. For I am wounded near death from the last of the old battles, and I can do no more. And very soon he died, and they buried him over the sea and under the stone, and there he lies until the day of our Lord. And so the Grail passed to my father's charge, and they guarded it in the land of Cornwall, where men still strove to keep alive the old ways. While in the east the men of Logres Well, in the east the men of evil grew more numerous, and the land of Logres grew dark. For Arthur was gone, and Mark was dead, and the new kings were not as the old had been. And with each of the years the Grail came to the charge of the eldest son, and at the last it came to me. And since the death of my father I have kept it safe, as best I might, in secret and in true faith. But I now grow old, and am childless. The greatest darkness of all comes upon our land. For the heathen men of evil, who came to the east years past, slew the Englishmen and took their land, are turning westward now, and we shall not be safe from them. The darkness draws towards Cornwall, and the long ships creep to our shore, and the battle is near, which we must lead to final defeat, and the end of all that we have known. No guardian for the Grail is left, since my brother's son, whom I loved as my own, is turned already to the heathen men and guides them to the west. And to save my life and the secret of the Grail that only its guardian knows, I must flee even as Bedwin the strange knight fled. But in all the land of Logres no haven remains, so that I must cross the sea to the land where they say Cornishmen have fled whenever terror comes. But the Grail may not leave this land, but must wait the Pendragon till the day comes. So therefore I trust it to this land, over sea and under stone, and I mark here the signs by which the proper man in the proper place may know where it lies, the signs that wax and wane, but do not die. The secret of its charge I may not write, but carry unspoken to my grave. Yet the man who finds the Grail and has other words from me will know, by both, the secret for himself. And for him is the charge, the promise, and the proof, and in his day the Pendragon shall come again. And that day shall see a new Logres, with evil cast out, when the old world shall appear no more than a dream. Great Uncle Mary stopped reading, but the children sat still and speechless as if his voice still rang out. The story seemed to fit so perfectly into the green land rolling below them that it was as if they sat in the middle of the pass. They could almost see the strange knight Bedwin riding toward them over the brow of a slope, and the long ships of the invaders lurking beyond the grey granite headland and its white fringe of surf. Simon said at last, "Who is the Pendragon?" "King Arthur," Barney said. Jane said nothing, but sat thinking of the sad Cornishman sailing away over the sea from his threatened land. She looked at Great Uncle Mary, and he was gazing unseeing down the sea in the headland beyond Trowasic, the taut lines of his face relaxed and wistful. When the old world, he repeated softly to himself, shall appear no more than a dream. Simon scrambled to his feet and went to crouch close to him, peering at the manuscript on his knee. Then the map must show where the Grail is. I say, suppose we find it. What will it mean? It will mean all kinds of things, Great Uncle Mary said grimly. And not all of them pleasant, perhaps. What will it look like? What is a Grail, anyway? A Grail is a kind of drinking vessel, a chalice, a cup, but not like an ordinary cup. Great Uncle Mary turned at them gravely. Now listen to me. This map you have found shows the way to a sign which men have been seeking for centuries. Really? Oh, hello. It is Gulliver time. Or maybe not. Are you going to come up here? I have made room. Yeah, come on. I know. There you go. Gulliver time. Yes, hi. Hello. Oh, big purrs. Yes. I should get a Gulliver camera. Yeah. For your fans. I'm just assuming that people will love him. He's a good boy. He's cute. Look at that face. Look at that face. He's an adorable face too. Oh, okay. Where was I? Now listen to me. This map you have found shows the way to a sign which men have been seeking for centuries. I said that I had been looking for it. But you remember I said that there were others too. The enemy side, if you like. These people are evil, and they can be very, very dangerous indeed. Great Uncle Mary spoke with a great seriousness, leaning forward, and the children gazed rather nervously back. They have been very close to me for a long time now, he said. And here, in Trowasic, they have been close to you, too. One of them is the man Norman Withers. Another is the woman who calls herself his sister. There may be others, but I do not know. Then the burglary. Wow. They stared at him, and Jane said, Was it them? Undoubtedly, Great Uncle Mary said. Not in person, perhaps, but they must have been behind it all. The ransacked books, the stolen maps, the attempt to look for a secret hiding place under the floor, they were very near, you know. Nearer than I. When I rented the Grey House, it was no more than a shot in the dark. I had narrowed the search down to the Tressawick area, but that was all, and I had no idea what I was looking for. It might have been anything. But they knew. Somehow, in some dark way, they had found out about the manuscript, and they came after it last night. Only they hadn't bargained for you finding it by chance first. He smiled slightly. I should like to see the Withers face today. Everything fits now, Simon said slowly. The way he made friends so quickly with Father, the way he took us out on the boat. For an unpleasant moment he heard Great Uncle Mary's voice, saying again emphatically, They can be very dangerous indeed. Barney said, But, Gumary, did you know that we should find whatever it was? Us, I mean, me, Simon, and Jane? His great uncle looked at him sharply. What makes you say that? Well, I don't know. Barney fumbled for words. You must have looked yourself before we came and not found anything. But when we did come, you were never there. You kept on disappearing, almost as if you were leaving the house to us. Great Uncle Mary smiled. Yes, Barney, he said. I did have an idea you might find it, because I know you three very well. That was one idea I had before our friends did. So that, for all their interest in the Grey House, they were still worried about what I was up to. And I led them a high old dance all over Cornwall while you were at home. I was, you might say, A red herring. But what? Barney said. Oh, never mind, Simon broke in. He'd been hovering restlessly at Great Uncle Mary's elbow. It's all obvious now. The thing is, what about the map? You're quite right. Uncle Mary sat down by the rock again. We haven't any time to lose. It's a map of Trevisick, Simon said eagerly. Jane found that out. Only the coast seems to have changed. I was comparing it with a map in the guidebook at the Grey House, Jane said. It hardly seemed worth mentioning her visit to the vicar. The funny thing is that though the outlines of the coast don't look alike, the names are the same. If you look very closely in the manuscript, one of the headlands is called King Mark's Head, only it's spelt all wrong. And that's the name the guidebook uses for Kenmare Head, so the manuscript must show Trevisick. That's right, Great Uncle Mary said, bent over the parchment. Simple corruption, dropping consonants. His head shot up. What did you say? Jane looked puzzled. Did you say it was called King Mark's Head in the guidebook? Yes, that's right. Does it matter? Oh, no. The usual remote expression came back over Great Uncle Mary's face like a veil. Only that particular name hasn't been used for a very long time now, and most people have forgotten about it. I should like to look at that guidebook of yours. I don't understand this, Simon said, peering over the map. Even if it is Trevisick, where does that get you? It's the most useless travel map I ever saw. There are all sorts of peculiar marks on it, but none of them means anything. Nothing leads to anything else. So how can it show where the Grail is? Great Uncle Mary pointed at the manuscript. Remember what the text says. For the proper man in the proper place to find. Perhaps it's like one of those mazes you see in books sometimes, Jane said, thinking hard. The ones that are simple once you get going, but it's awful hard to find where to start. That could be what he meant by in the proper place. If you took the map to the right starting point, then it would tell you where to go from there. Simon almost wailed. But how do we find where to start from? Barney, standing at Great Uncle Mary's elbow, had not been listening. He had lapsed into one of his dreaming silences, gazing wide-eyed out over the harbor and occasionally glancing back at the map. I know what it reminds me of, he said musingly. No one took any notice. Barney went on dreamily to himself. It's like one of Mother's drawings, the ones she calls perspective sketches. It looks like a picture, not a map, at all, really. You've got the bump of this hill coming down over the edge of the harbor, and when you look down and the headland curving like that, he traced his finger along the air over the view before him, and those stones on top of it make the funny little knobs at the sign of the map. Golly, he's got it, Simon shouted, jerking Barney out of his reverie. That's what it is. Look, it's a picture and not a map. That's why the shape looked all wrong compared with the guidebook. Look, you can see. He took the manuscript carefully from Great Uncle Mary's hands and held it up in front of them against the long, rocky arm of Kenmare Head. And as they looked from the headland back to the manuscript, the scrawled brown lines seemed suddenly so obviously a picture of the scene before them that they wondered how they could possibly have thought it was a map. Well then, Jane said, incredulously spreading over her face as she looked from one to the other, this must be the proper place, the beginning of the maze. All this time, without knowing it, we've been standing in the very same spot as the man who drew the picture. Just think! She looked at the manuscript in awe. Well, come on, Barney said, glowing with excitement at what he had discovered. We know where he started from. How do we find out where he went from here? Look at the picture. There is a sort of blotch marked on this headland. There are blotches all over the place. Half of them are blots and the rest are dirt marks. The marks of age, Great Uncle Mary said sepulchrally. Excuse me. No, but this one's intentional, Simon persisted. Right there where... Gosh, it must be that rock you're leaning on, Gamary. His great-uncle looked around critically. Well, it's possible, I suppose. Yes, indeed it's possible. A natural outcropping, I think. Not erected by the hands of man. Barney got up and trotted all around the rock, gazing closely at its yellow lichen scars and every small crevice and cleft, but noticing nothing unusual. It looks very ordinary, he said in disappointment, reappearing on the other side. Jane burst out laughing. You look just like Rufus, sniffing along after a rabbit, then finding nothing there after all. Barney slapped his knee. I knew we should have brought Rufus. He would have been terrifically useful on a hunt, sniffing things out. You can't sniff things out when they're hidden for centuries, idiot. I don't see why not. You wait. I bet he'll help. Not a hope. Okay. Not a hope. Where is he, anyway? With Mrs. Polk. Shut up somewhere, I suppose, poor thing. You know, Father said he wouldn't have him in the house anymore when he got in a rage the other night. Mrs. Polk takes him home every evening. If she hadn't taken him home yesterday evening, he might have caught the burglars. Gosh, so he would. There was a moment of silence as they all digested the thought. I don't trust Mrs. Polk, Jane said darkly. Well, don't worry about it, Great Uncle Mary said easily. From what I know of that dog, he must have licked their hands and told them to go ahead. He'd have just licked their hands and told them to go ahead. Go ahead. He doesn't like Mr. Withers, Barney said. He came to us wagging his tail when we came off the boat yesterday. When he saw Mr. Withers, his tail went right down and he barked. We all laughed about it at the time, he added thoughtfully. Well, we'll bring him out tomorrow. But we shall have to go home soon, and we aren't any nearer to the beginning. Mary, could this rock really mean anything? Simon rubbed its gray surface doubtfully. Perhaps it's in line with something, Jane said hopefully, like a compass bearing. Look on the map, the picture. Doesn't help. It could be in line with any of those blotches. Well then we ought to find out where all the blotches are and go and see if there's anything near one of them. But that would take months. Oh, Barney stamped on his foot with impatience. This is awful. What are we going to do? Leave it, Great Uncle Mary said unexpectedly. Leave it? They stared at him. Leave it until tomorrow. Come to it with fresh minds. We haven't much time and it's going to be a race in the end, but we're all right at the moment. The other side doesn't know that we've found anything. They watch me like hawks, but they don't suspect you. And with any luck, they won't. You can afford to go away and think about it for tonight. Won't they come back and burgle us again? Jane said nervously. They wouldn't dare. Not that. No, that was a long shot. They staked everything on being able to find a clue the first time, and they failed. They'll try something different now. I wish we knew what. Great Uncle Mary, Simon said. Why can't we tell the police it was them? Then they wouldn't be able to come after us at all. Yes, said Jane eagerly. Why not? We can't possibly, Barney said with conviction. Why not? I don't know. They looked at Great Uncle Mary. He said noncommittally, Why didn't you tell the police that you thought you knew what the burglars had been after? Well, they'd have laughed. They'd have thought it was just an old bit of paper. And if we'd gone to them, it wouldn't have been a secret anymore, and we shouldn't have been able to follow up the map. And anyway, Jane said, with a return of the old guiltiness. We hadn't told Mother and Father, but finding it in the first place. Well, Great Uncle Mary said, you would have said to them, we found an old parchment in the attic, and we think that's what the burglars were looking for when they turned the house upside down. And our worthy sergeant, who was satisfied that the culprits were just hooligans, would have smiled indulgently and told you to go away and play. That's right, that's just it, that's why we didn't. Great Uncle Mary smiled. Now, I could go to him and say this manuscript is a clue to a kind of ancient cup called the Grail that is hidden in Trowsic. It tells the real story of King Arthur. The man from the yacht called the Lady Mary wants it, and he burgled the house, and he has me followed night and day to discover if I have found it before him. And what would happen? They'd go and arrest Mr. Withers, Simon said hopefully. But he sounded less convinced than before. I'm not going to redo that line. The sergeant would go to Mr. Withers, who would, of course, have a perfect alibi for the night of the burglary, and he would, question him rather apologetically about my odd-sounding story. Mr. Withers would impress him as a courteous and gentlemanly antique dealer on a harmless holiday with his pretty sister. That's what we thought he was, Barney pointed out. The sergeant knows of me, Great Uncle Mary went on, and knows I do things that sometimes seem, he chuckled, eccentric. He would think things over, and he'd say to himself, poor old professor, 'tis all been too much for him at last. All that book learning tan natural. It do have turned the poor old chap's head. You do it even better than Simon, Jane said admiringly. Yes, 'cause me trying to do Uncle Mary make him sound like the sergeant. Yeah, that. I'm so sorry. I see now, Simon said. It would just sound fantastic. And if we told the sergeant about Mr. Withers and his sister asking questions about old books, it would seem perfectly normal to him and not suspicious at all. He looked up and grinned. Of course, we wouldn't possibly tell them. Sorry, I didn't think. Well, you must think now, and seriously, Great Uncle Mary said, turning his grave dark eyes on each face in turn. I am going to say something I shan't say again. You may think it the same as the sergeant would, that this is all a business of private rivalry, an old professor and a book collector, both intent on beating the other to something that doesn't matter much to anyone else anyway. No, of course not. It's something much more than that, Jane said impulsively. I've got a feeling. Well, if you all have a feeling, if you understand just a little of the things I was trying to say earlier on, then that's more than enough. But I am not happy about having the three of you mixed up in this at all. And I should be even less happy if I thought you didn't have any idea of what you were doing. You make it sound fearfully serious, Simon said curiously. So it is. I worry because I can only be on the edge all the time, acting as a decoy, making them think that they have nobody to bother except me. So that you are left all on your own with the responsibility of unraveling this. He touched the manuscript in Simon's hand, step by difficult step. Smashing, Barney said happily. Simon glanced at his brother and sister and drew himself up, trying to look as dignified as possible to look in shorts and sandals. Well, I'm the eldest. Only by 11 months, said Jane. Well, I am anyway, and I'm responsible for you, too. And I ought to be spokesman, and he floundered, and then gave up all attempt at dignity in a rush. And honestly, Gameri, we do know what we're doing. In a way, it is kind of a quest, like Barney said, and it isn't as if we were all together on our own. All right, Great Uncle Mary said. It's a bargain. And he shook his hand solemnly with each of them in turn. Everyone looked at everyone else, wide-eyed and a little breathless. Then they all suddenly felt rather foolish and burst out laughing. But behind the laughter they were dimly aware of a new kind of comforting closeness in the face of possible danger. Then they packed up and started down the hill. Great Uncle Mary said, stopping them in their tracks. Take a good look at first. He swept his arm over the harbor and the cliffs and the sea. Take the real picture back with you too. Learn what it looks like. They looked across from the slope once more. The sun was setting down on the westward sky over Khmer Hill, and the grey house lighting the top of the headland and the strange grey rocks that prickled its skyline. But the harbor was already darkening into shadow. As they looked, the sun seemed gradually to fall until the unbearable brightness of it was over the outlined fingers of the group standing stones, and the stones themselves became invisible in the blaze. Yep, that's all my voice is going to be able to take, so short one today, but yeah, we got chapter 6 done.